Go find the oldest building in your town, the courthouse, the church, the bank with the stone face, and stand in the doorway. Reach up. In most of them you will not touch the top of the frame. Now, walk into any building put up after about 1950 and try the same thing. Your fingertips will brush the lintel or come close enough that you feel it. That gap between the two, roughly a foot, sometimes 2, sometimes 4, is not decoration, and it is not an accident. It is the residue of an argument about money, air, disease, and taxes that nobody alive today remembers having. However, the buildings remember it, because they were built as the settlement of that argument. The modern interior door in the United States is 80 inches tall, 6 feet 8 inches. Go measure the one on your bedroom right now, and you will almost certainly find that number. Give or take the thickness of the threshold. It is so standard, I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. That the lumberyard does not ask you what height you want. They ask you what width. Height is assumed, the way the voltage in your wall is assumed. Now go measure a door in a building put up before 1900, a farmhouse, a schoolhouse, a mill, a row house, a country church. What you tend to find is 84 inches, 7 feet, or 90 inches, or 96, a full 8 feet, on the front entrance of anything with money behind it. The exterior doors on a lot of 19th century civic buildings run 10 feet and up, and the frames around them run higher still. In the same buildings, the ceilings run 10, 12, 14 feet. In tenements, the cheapest housing being built for the poorest people in the industrial world, the ceiling was still commonly 9 feet. Sit with that a moment. The cheapest room a landlord could legally rent to a family in Manhattan in 1885 had more air above the occupant's head than a mid-range suburban house has today. The people were shorter, the heating was worse, the construction was slower, and the material was more expensive per square foot in labor terms. Everything about the economics of that moment should have pushed ceilings down and doors short. Instead, height went up. There is a story that circulates about this, and you have probably run into it. The story says the height is evidence that the buildings were not made for us. It says the doors were sized for people who were bigger, and that the ground level we see now is not the original ground level, that first floors are buried, that whole streets were filled in after some event that got cut out of the record. That story goes by a few names now. Mud flood, reset, old world architecture. And I want to deal with it honestly, because there is a real observation buried in it, and there are also several very well documented answers that the people telling the story usually have not looked up. So this is the plan. We are going to take the observation seriously, because the observation is correct. Doors and ceilings really were taller, everywhere, across cultures that were not in contact, and then they really did shrink fast in the middle of the 20th century. Then we are going to find out who paid for that height, who taxed it, who legislated it, and who eventually decided it was no longer worth the money. Because the answer is not that the world forgot how to build tall rooms. The answer is that height stopped being a thing you were required to buy and started being a thing you were charged extra for. That switch has a date, it has legislation attached, and it has an industrial supply chain behind it. Let us start with the part of the story that is true, and then let us start pulling. The first thing to establish is that people got taller, not shorter. This matters because the whole giant's premise depends on the opposite. The economic historians Roderick Floud, Robert Fogel, and their collaborators spent decades assembling height data from military recruitment records, prison intake books, and slave manifests, because height is one of the few biological measurements that bureaucracies recorded consistently on ordinary people for centuries. What that work shows is that the average adult male in Britain and much of Europe was around 5'5" to 5'7" through most of the 18th and 19th centuries, and that in the industrial cities the average actually dropped during the worst decades of the 19th century before recovering. Dutch men, now the tallest population on Earth at around 6 foot, averaged around 5'4" in the middle of the 19th century. They gained roughly 8 inches in 150 years. So the doors were getting taller, while the people using them were, if anything, getting shorter. Any honest version of this investigation has to start by admitting that the height of the door has no relationship at all to the height of the person walking through it, which is exactly what makes it interesting. If the door is not sized to the body, it is sized to something else. Find that something else, and you find the money. Here is the first candidate, and it is the one that explains more of the 19th century than anything else on the list. Air. For most of the period we are talking about, the governing theory of disease in the Western world was miasma. The belief was that illness came from foul air, from the vapor rising off waste and stagnant water and crowded bodies. It was wrong about the mechanism, since the pathogens were bacteria and viruses, and the transmission was water and contact and droplets, but it was correct in almost every practical instruction it gave. Ventilate, separate, move waste away from where people sleep, give every body a volume of air. Edwin Chadwick published his report on the sanitary condition of the labouring population of Great Britain in 1842, and it is one of the most consequential documents of the century. It counted deaths by neighbourhood and street and found that a labourer in Liverpool could expect to live half as long as a gentleman in a rural county. The response was legislation, the Public Health Act of 1848 first, and then a cascade of building and housing acts that ran through the rest of the century in Britain and were copied across the Atlantic. And here is the mechanism that put the height in your door frame. Those laws did not regulate square footage. They regulated cubic feet of air per person. That is the pivot. If your legal obligation is to provide a floor area, you build low ceilings and wide rooms, because floor is the expensive part. If your legal obligation is to provide a volume of air, the cheapest possible way to satisfy it is to build up, because vertical space costs almost nothing compared to land. A landlord in London or New York in 1880 who had to certify a given number of cubic feet per lodger had an obvious move available. Keep the footprint, raise the ceiling. The height was not generosity, it was the least expensive route to compliance. In England, the common statutory figure for lodging houses came to 300 cubic feet per adult, with some authorities pushing for 400, and there were sanitary inspectors whose job was to arrive with a measuring rod and multiply. In the American cities, the New York Tenement House Act of 1867 was the first serious attempt at the same thing, requiring a window in every room and a certain volume, and the 1879 amendment produced the notorious dumbbell tenement with its air shaft, an architecture invented purely to satisfy a light and air requirement at the minimum possible cost. The Tenement House Act of 1901, driven by Lawrence Vailor and the reform photography of Jacob Riis, tightened it again and effectively ended that building type. Look at what that legislation actually was, in economic terms. It was a mandatory minimum purchase. The state told a landlord that he could not sell a cubic foot of housing below a certain quantity. He could not offer a cheaper, smaller, lower unit even if a tenant wanted one, and tenants often did want one because a smaller room is a cheaper room. Height was compulsory consumption. That is why the poorest housing of the era has ceilings that look luxurious to us. It was not luxury. It was a floor set by law that could not be undercut. The second candidate is fire and smoke, and it is physical rather than legal. Every one of those buildings was heated by combustion and lit by combustion. Coal grates, wood stoves, whale oil, then kerosene, then coal gas. All of it produced heat, soot, and consumed oxygen in the room where people were sitting. Hot air rises and stratifies. In a room with a 12-foot ceiling and an open fire, the top 3 or 4 feet of the room becomes a reservoir for the worst of it. The smoke and the spent air and the excess heat, and the people below live in the cleaner layer. That is not a theory anyone had to write down. It is something you learn in one winter. Lower that ceiling to 8 feet with the same fire, and you are breathing the reservoir. Gaslighting made it sharper. Coal gas lamps burned dirty, blackened plaster, tarnished silver, killed houseplants, and gave people headaches, and the standard architectural response was ceiling height plus ventilating registers near the top of the wall. The ornamental plaster ceiling rose that sits above so many 19th century chandeliers is frequently not ornamental at all. Many of them are ventilators, with a duct behind them, put there to pull the fumes of the gas fixture out of the room. The decoration is the cover plate on a piece of ventilation equipment. Governments have almost never been able to measure income directly. Before modern accounting and payroll withholding, a tax collector standing in a street had to find something visible, countable, and impossible to hide, and use that as a proxy for wealth. The history of pre-modern taxation is basically a history of what was easy to count from outside a building, and every one of those choices bent the architecture. England taxed hearths from 1,662, 2 shillings per fireplace per year, and collectors had a right of entry to count them, which people hated enough that it was repealed in 1689. So the state switched to something it could count without going inside. Windows. The window tax ran from 1696 to 1851, charging a flat house duty plus an escalating amount by the number of windows, and the response is still visible on British streets today. Bricked-up window openings, blank arches with masonry infill, houses built with fewer and larger openings. People literally walled up the light to lower the assessment, and the phrase daylight robbery is commonly traced to it. Now notice what a window tax does to a room. If you are charged per opening but not per square foot of glass, and you still need light, the rational move is fewer windows that are much taller. Tall windows demand tall walls. Tall walls give you tall rooms, and once the room is tall, the door has to be proportioned to the room, or the whole facade looks wrong. A tax on the count of holes in a wall produced, downstream, the 11-foot ceiling. France did something similar and worse for a while, with a tax assessed on doors and windows introduced in 1798 and not fully abolished until 1926. Over a century of French building happened under a regime that charged you for openings. In Amsterdam, the property tax leaned on frontage width, and the result is the famous canal house, narrow as a corridor and deep and tall, with the hoisting beam under the gable because the staircase inside is too tight to move furniture, and so everything comes in through the window on a rope. Every one of those is a case where a room got its shape from a line in a ledger. The building is the tax code, made out of brick. Which brings us to the part of the story that the mud flood version is actually built on, and I want to give it a full hearing, because the people who notice it are noticing something real. Go to a lot of American and European cities and you will find buildings whose ground floor windows sit half below the current sidewalk, in a sunken well with a railing around it. You will find doors that are clearly finished, clearly meant to be entrances, opening onto a wall of earth. You will find arched openings in basements that line up with nothing. In Seattle you can take a paid tour of an entire street level that is now underground. The observation is not imaginary. Something buried those floors. Here is what buried them, and it is documented to the minute in city council records, because it was expensive and controversial, and people complained about it in the newspapers the whole time. Chicago, in the early 1850s, was built on flat, swampy ground barely above the level of the lake, with no drainage gradient at all. Sewage sat in the streets, and cholera and dysentery came through repeatedly. The Chicago Board of Sewerage Commissioners hired Ellis Chesbrough, who had built water systems in Boston, and he told them the only workable answer was to lay the sewers on top of the existing ground and then raise the entire city up over them by 4 to 8 feet, sometimes more. Starting in 1858, they did exactly that. Streets were raised, buildings were jacked up on hundreds of screwjacks and walked upward while people kept working inside them. A young contractor named George Pullman, who later built the sleeping car and the company town, made his early reputation on that work, and there is a well-known account of the 6-story brick Tremont House Hotel being lifted with guests still in residence and not a cracked pane of glass. Buildings whose owners would not pay to be raised simply stayed where they were, and the street rose past their windows, and their first floor became a basement. Seattle burned in June 1889, and in the rebuilding the city took the chance to fix its tidal drainage problem, which had been bad enough that toilets in the lower district ran backward at high tide. They regraded the streets 1 to 2 stories above the old grade. Merchants rebuilt in stone and kept trading on the old level, while the new sidewalks went in overhead, and for years people used ladders to cross from one to the other. Before I go further, that that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Eventually, the old level was condemned and sealed, and that is the underground you can walk through today. Galveston, Texas, was destroyed by the hurricane of 1,900, which killed somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 people and remains the deadliest natural disaster in United States history. The response was a seawall and then a grade raising, from 1904 to 1911, in which the city was dredged full of sand and lifted in places by 17 feet, with the churches and homes jacked up and slurry pumped underneath them. Over 2,000 buildings were razed. So yes, there are cities with buried ground floors and a discontinuous street level. And every one I have looked into has a public works file behind it, a contractor, a bond issue, and a very unhappy set of property owners. It was not a flood of mud arriving. It was a city deciding to buy itself a drainage gradient and putting it on the tax rolls. And the sunken window itself was usually deliberate anyway. The English basement, with its arroway and its iron railing and its half-sunk windows, was a design, not an accident. It put the kitchen, the coal store, the laundry and the servants below the street, and the coal chute opened straight from the pavement into the cellar, so the delivery never came through the house. In New York and Boston and Philadelphia, the same arrangement gave you the stoop, that flight of steps up to a raised parlour floor, precisely because the working floor had been pushed down. The Dutch brought the stope with them for a different reason, flood, and it stuck, which leaves the honest version of the observation. The floors are buried, the burying is documented and financed. The doors are still too tall, and the burying does not explain the doors, because the doors are tall on buildings that were never raised, on farms, on prairie churches, in towns that never had a sewer problem at all. So we go back to the money. What did that height actually cost the builder? This is where the giant's premise runs into its hardest problem, and it is not a philosophical problem, it is an invoice. A 19th century wall was expensive per square foot in ways that a modern wall is not. Brick was laid by hand by a mason paid by the day or by the thousand. Lath was split or sawn and nailed up strip by strip. Plaster went on in 3 coats, scratch, brown and finish, each one requiring a separate visit and a curing period, and the lime for it was burned in kilns fired with wood or coal. Every additional foot of ceiling height cost real money in material and in skilled labour across the entire perimeter of every room in the building. The technology that made the height affordable at all arrived in Chicago in the 1830s, and it is one of the most underrated inventions in the history of housing, the balloon frame. Instead of heavy timber posts and beams cut and joined by a skilled framer, you use a cage of light sawn studs running continuously from the sill to the roof plate, held together with machine-made nails. It worked because 2 things became cheap at the same moment: mass-produced cut nails and steam-sawn dimensional lumber. It let a small crew with ordinary skills put up a building fast, and critically, it made a tall wall barely more difficult than a short one because you were just buying longer sticks. That is worth pausing on. The continuous stud in a true balloon frame runs the full height of the building, 2 stories or more, in a single piece. The lumber trade sold studs in lengths that made 10 and 11-foot ceilings natural. The height was not being carefully bought. It was falling out of the standard length of the raw material. And when the standard length of the raw material changed later, so did the ceilings, and nobody voted on it. Then there is the reason that gets the least attention and probably deserves the most, because it is the one that shows up in every culture that had any surplus at all. Height was the display. It was the visible signal of status, and it was priced accordingly. In the Italian palazzo, the piano nobile is the floor with the highest ceiling and the tallest windows, 1 flight up from the street, above the noise and the smell and below the climb. That is where the family lived and received. The floors above it get progressively shorter and cheaper, and the servants slept under the roof where you could not stand up straight. Height was rank, and it was legible from the street because you could count the window courses and see where the tall ones were. Paris made that gradient into a formal price list. When George Eugene Haussmann rebuilt the city for Napoleon III between 1853 and 1870, the new boulevards came with rules that fixed facade lines, roof angles, and floor heights, and the buildings that went up along them repeated the same section over and over. Ground floor for shops, entresol low and cramped for the shopkeeper. Then the second floor, the tall one, with the long windows and the continuous iron balcony, which was the expensive apartment. Then progressively smaller floors above, and finally the chambres de bonne under the zinc roof, tiny rooms with sloping ceilings for the domestic staff. Rent fell as you climbed, because climbing was the cost. In a building with no elevator, the tall room on the second floor was the product, and everything above it was the discount rack. Then Elisha Otis demonstrated a safety brake for a hoist at the New York Crystal Palace exhibition in 1854, cutting the rope in front of a crowd to show the platform would not fall, and the first passenger elevator went into a Broadway store in 1857. Within a few decades, that single device flipped the entire vertical price gradient. Once you could ride, the top floor became the penthouse, and the view became the premium, and the servants got moved out of the attic. The same room, in the same building, changed price because the cost of reaching it changed. Nothing about the architecture moved, only the machine at the end of the hallway. So by around 1900, you have a world where tall rooms are simultaneously required by sanitary law, produced almost automatically by the framing system and the lumber supply, needed as functioning ventilation for open flame heat and light, encouraged by taxes that counted openings rather than area, and sold as status. 5 separate forces all pushing the same direction. That is why the height is everywhere, and why it looks like a decision nobody made. It was not one decision, it was 5, stacked. Now watch all 5 of them get removed inside about 50 years. The first to go was the ventilation function, and it went because the machinery arrived. Central heating with a furnace and ducts meant heat could be delivered evenly rather than radiating from a fire in one wall. Electric lighting, spreading through the 1880s and after, meant illumination that did not consume oxygen or blacken plaster. Willis Carrier built the first modern air conditioning system in 1902 for a printing plant in Brooklyn to control humidity so the ink would register properly, and cooling for human comfort followed from there into theatres, then offices, then houses after the Second World War. Every one of those inventions did, mechanically and for money, the job that a 12-foot ceiling had been doing for free. Once you can buy air movement by the unit, air volume stops being something you have to build. The second to go was the legal minimum, and this is the part almost nobody knows. The cubic air rules did not survive the transition to modern codes intact. As building regulation professionalized in the 20th century, it shifted from volume per occupant to a floor area per occupant, plus a mechanical ventilation rate in cubic feet per minute. Once the ventilation requirement is expressed as a flow that a fan provides, the ceiling height requirement collapses to a bare minimum for headroom and nothing more. In American residential codes, that minimum settled around 7 feet 6 inches, later 7 feet in many places for habitable rooms, not a target, a floor, and builders build to floors. The third to go was the supply chain, and this is where the 80-inch door actually comes from. Through the 1920s, the American millwork industry standardized hard, driven by the trade associations and by the Commerce Department under Herbert Hoover, who ran a national simplified practice campaign explicitly aimed at cutting the number of sizes and varieties of manufactured goods. Doors, windows, mouldings, and stock cabinets all got shrunk into catalogue ranges. Sears sold entire houses by mail order, tens of thousands of them, pre-cut and numbered, and those kits were designed around the sizes the mills already ran. The 6-foot 8-inch door won not because anyone decided it was the right height for a human being, but because it was the size that could be made in the largest quantity at the lowest unit cost. Then gypsum board finished the job. Plaster and lath was replaced by manufactured panels, and the panel came 4 feet wide and 8 feet long because that was what handled and shipped and fit a truck. 2 courses laid horizontally give you a wall 8 feet high with no cutting and no waste. Frame the wall at 8 feet, and a 6-foot 8-inch door leaves exactly enough space above it for the header and a foot of wall. The entire modern American room is a consequence of the dimensions of a sheet of manufactured material. Nobody living inside those proportions chose them. A logistics constraint chose them. The fourth force to go was the labour and material economics, and it went during the war and the housing shortage after it. Wartime construction limitation orders restricted materials for anything not essential, and when the restrictions lifted, there were millions of returning servicemen with federally backed mortgages and nowhere to live. The Federal Housing Administration underwriting standards set minimum property requirements that lenders enforced, and those minimums became the actual specification for the whole industry, because a house that did not qualify for the loan could not be sold. Minimums became maximums. Levitt and Sons put up the first Levittown on Long Island starting in 1947, using a divided sequence of crews moving house to house, and the product had 8-foot ceilings and standard doors, and it sold as fast as it could be built. That is the moment the height leaves. Not a catastrophe, not a lost civilization. A financing standard, a sheet size, and a stripped-down code minimum, all landing in the same decade. And the fifth force, status, did not disappear. It simply moved to the other side of the ledger. Height stopped being a legal obligation and became an upgrade, something you pay extra for. That is the whole trick, and it is the reason this story is worth telling as economics rather than as mystery. Real estate in most of the English-speaking world is priced by square foot. Cubic feet do not appear on the listing, which means the volume of air in a room is invisible to the price index, and therefore any builder who lowers a ceiling captures the saving and pays no penalty in the appraisal. A 9-foot ceiling in a new house today is sold as an amenity, listed alongside granite and stainless at a premium. The identical dimension that was compulsory in a Manhattan tenement in 1885 is now a luxury feature. The oil shock of 1973 pushed the same direction one more time, because heating and cooling cost is a function of volume, not floor area, and every foot of unused height above a person's head is conditioned air being paid for by the month. Suspended acoustic tile ceilings dropped through millions of older commercial rooms in exactly those years, hiding the original height above a grid of aluminum and mineral fibre. Walk into an old bank with a chain pharmacy in it and look up past the light fixtures. The plaster cornice is usually still there in the dark. Before we close it out, the small explanations deserve their moment, because they get offered constantly and they are mostly wrong. Doors were not made tall for top hats, since a hat is removed at the threshold, and the fashion did not reach the farms and mills that have the same tall doors. They were not made for coffins, since coffins are carried level, and the constraint on a funeral is the stair turn and the width of the parlour. They were not made for hoop skirts, which are a width problem. And they were not made for taller people, since the measured record says the opposite. Every one of these tries to fit the door to a body. The door was never fitted to a body. It was fitted to a rule, a fuel, a tax, and a length of sawn timber. So here is the thing to actually do, and it costs nothing. Find the oldest building near you that you can walk into. Measure the door, top of the opening to the finished floor. Then measure the door of the newest building you can find. Write both numbers down. Then find out what year the older one was built, and go look up what the housing or sanitary ordinance in that town required at the time and what the local mill was cutting. Those records exist, and they are usually public, in a county archive or a historical society or a digitized newspaper, and almost nobody ever asks for them. You will not find giants. You will find a receipt. You will find that somebody, at some point, was compelled to buy that air, and that later on somebody else worked out how to stop paying for it and sell it back by the foot. The buildings did not shrink because the world got smaller. They shrank because the thing they were made of, obligation, was repealed. Make of that what you will.